believe a disaster starts with a bang. They imagine the cinematic roar of fire, the sudden wail of sirens, and the chaotic shouting of men in hard hats. But those who have spent their lives deep inside the gut of an industrial plant know better. They know that a true disaster doesn't announce itself with a shout. It starts with a whisper. A tiny, high-pitched scream that only the metal itself can emit. It is the sound of a billion-dollar asset beginning to eat its own heart. A microscopic fracture in the reality of a machine. Today, we are stepping into the Northern Hydroelectric Plant. This isn't just a facility, it is a cathedral of the industrial age. To walk onto the main floor is to feel the weight of history and the raw power of gravity. The ceiling is 10 stories high, lost in a canopy of steel girders and shadows, where old, yellow bridge cranes sleep. The air here has a specific flavor, a sharp, electric tang of ozone, mixed with the heavy organic scent of hot turbine oil, and the damp, cold breath of the river pressing against the concrete walls outside. At the heart of this cathedral stands Turbine number 4. They call it the Beast. 50 tons of rotating steel, spinning at 300 revolutions per minute. When it's running perfectly, the floor doesn't shake. It purrs. It creates a magnetic field so intense that it can pull the loose change right out of your pocket if you stand too close to the casing. It is a monument to human engineering, a bridge between the wild energy of falling water and the silent flow of electricity. And then there is Victor. At 64 years old, Victor is a man made of the same materials as the plant: iron, oil, and silence. His hands are a living archive. Scars from a slipped gear in the 80s, chemical burns from the 90s, and a permanent layer of grease that no soap can ever truly reach. Victor doesn't speak the language of management. He doesn't have an MBA. But Victor has something that cannot be taught in a classroom. He has the ear. He knows the turbine better than he knows his own pulse. There it was, the first warning. A high-pitched whistle that felt like a needle in the ear. To the young engineers in the control room, it was just background noise, part of the industrial symphony. But to Victor, standing near the bearing housing of number 4, it was a death rattle. He didn't need to look at a monitor to know what was happening. Deep inside the sleeve bearing, a channel no wider than a pencil, the oil flow was being strangled. Petrified slag, decades of microscopic deposits, had finally found a home. The steel was beginning to starve. Victor spent the next hour performing a ritual that the digital age has forgotten. He didn't pull out a diagnostic tablet. He laid his bare palm against the vibrating housing. He felt the frequency. He felt the heat. It wasn't the heat of a healthy machine. It was the fever of a dying one. He knew that physics doesn't care about quarterly goals. If that friction wasn't stopped, the bearing would expand, the shaft would seize, and the momentum of 50 tons of steel would transform the entire machine hall into a graveyard of shrapnel. He climbed the stairs to the Aquarium, the glass-walled office of the new chief engineer, Mark. Mark was the embodiment of the modern world. He was 28, dressed in a crisp polo shirt, and viewed the plant through the lens of a $2 million AI sensor array. To Mark, the world was a collection of data points. If the data said the machine was green, the machine was green. The conversation two eras. Victor, covered in the reality of the floor, tried to explain the sound. Mark, protected by the glass, pointed to his screen. The sensors showed a bearing temperature of exactly 65 degrees. The vibration analyzers showed perfect stability. Mark's conclusion was logical. Victor was an old man hearing ghosts in the machinery. He viewed Victor's warning as an expensive inconvenience. In Mark's world, stopping the turbine meant a loss of $150,000 an hour. He wasn't going to lose his bonus over an old man's feeling. And then the floor began to speak. A groan that vibrated in the soles of Victor's boots. The consultants arrived at noon. They were men in slim-fit suits who brought laser alignment tools and spectral analyzers. They billed the company $50,000 to do exactly what Mark wanted. They confirmed the data. They ran simulations. They checked the code. They found that the software was performing flawlessly. This is the great trap of the modern age. The belief that the map is the territory. The consultants were measuring the idea of the machine, but Victor was listening to the fact of it. The sensors were failing because they were placed for convenience, not for the reality of a clogged oil channel. They were measuring the temperature of the casing, while the core of the bearing was already reaching the melting point of lead. Victor watched them from the shadows of the mezzanine. He saw the expensive tools and the confident smiles. He knew he couldn't win an argument against a spreadsheet. So, he did what a man of the ground up does. He prepared for the inevitable. He went to the basement workshop. He retrieved a manual bypass wrench, a massive 60-pound beast of iron that hadn't been touched since 1974. He cleaned it. He oiled it. He waited. By late afternoon, the silence in the plant had changed. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a storm. That ever continued to rush through the intake valves, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the machine hall. The grid demanded power. The lights in the city remained on. But deep inside turbine number 4, the physics of friction were winning. The steel scream was no longer a whistle. It was becoming a roar. At 2 a.m., the Aquarium finally lost its confidence. The floor in the control room began to rattle. Not a vibration, but a violent, rhythmic shaking that sent coffee mugs sliding across desks. The screens that had been a steady, arrogant green for days didn't just turn yellow. They flashed a violent, emergency red. The temperature didn't climb. It exploded. It jumped from 60 degrees to 200 in the space of 90 seconds. The critical error messages began to scroll across the monitors. The digital world had finally met the physical one, and the digital world was losing. Mark tried to initiate the automated emergency shutdown. He tapped the glass of his tablet. Nothing happened. The automated bypass valve, the electronic savior of the plant, had seized. The heat had expanded the metal housing, locking the valve in the open position. The beast was now out of control. A runaway train made of 50 tons of steel, and the sensors could do nothing but watch it die. The consultants were the first to run. They recognized that their laptops were useless against a machine that was about to disintegrate. Mark stood frozen behind his glass wall, paralyzed by the failure of his data. He had been taught how to manage a system, but he had never been taught how to fight a machine. out the batoon, watching his orchestra set the stage on fire. But Victor was already on the move. He didn't run for the exit. He ran toward the heat. He didn't need an alarm to tell him the time was up. He moved with the practiced, economical grace of a man who had been here before. He didn't look at the flashing red lights. He looked at the steam beginning to hiss from the seals of the turbines. He smelled the unmistakable scent of burning oil, the smell of a machine's lifeblood turning into smoke. This is the moment where blue-collar brilliance becomes a force of nature. Victor didn't use an app. He used 300 pounds of torque and 30 years of knowing exactly where to strike a stuck gear. He shoved the manual wrench into the bypass assembly. The heat was blistering, enough to singe the hair on his arms, but he didn't flinch. He signaled to his crew, men he had trained, men who trusted the grease on their hands more than the pixels on a screen. They threw their weight against the iron. This wasn't a high-tech solution. This was a battle. It was a struggle of human muscle against an industrial, eased-up nightmare. 1 inch, then 2. The valve, crusted with years of neglect and petrified oil, groaned. It resisted with the stubbornness of a dying giant. Victor felt the steel through the wrench. He felt the moment the internal slag finally shattered. With a sound like a gunshot, the valve broke free. The oil surged. The high-pitched scream of the turbine instantly dropped an octave, then another. The violent shaking of the floor subsided into a steady, heavy thrum. The heat began to dissipate, drawn away by the fresh flow of lubricant. Victor didn't celebrate. He didn't check a monitor to see if he had succeeded. He simply kept his hand on the metal, feeling the pulse of the beast return to a healthy, rhythmic beat. When the sun rose, the northern plant was still standing. The grid remained stable. The lights in the city never even flickered. Mark and the consultants were gone, back to their offices to write reports that would somehow frame this as a system anomaly. But on the machine hall floor, Victor was wiping the black grease from his hands with a rag that was more oil than cloth. He knew the truth. Data is a map, but experience is the terrain. This is blue-collar brilliance. The mastery that can't be downloaded, only earned through grit. Join us next time for more stories from the ground up.